My name is Isaac Grossoff. I'm the president of the Humanist League. We're the club here at CMU that organized this event. Our club is all about building a community around the philosophy of dialogue over dogma. So we can learn more about other people by discussion. We can learn more about our views by discussion. And it's also based around humanism, which is a sort of life philosophy based not around, some sort of faith, or based not around some sort of historical practice, but the idea that every individual is fundamentally valuable, and then we can build from there based on things like science, based on things like reason, to create a better world for everybody. Our club organizes two big types of events. We have speaker events like we're having today, which I'm really excited about, and we have our discussion meetings, which happen every Tuesday this semester at 4:30. They're in room Wien 5310, and it's a great way if you're interested in, talking about topics like what you're seeing today, but every week and with people like you. To sign up for our email list so you can hear about all our meetings and what our topics are going to be about, you can either see me, see any of our organizers, or go to cmuhl.org to sign up for our mailing list there. So I'm really excited for today's event and to tell you a bit more about this event is in memory of, it's named after Carl Sagan. And for those of you who might not know who he was a great scientist, but also a great popularizer of science and of taking scientific ideas and thinking about how to apply them philosophically to how we should treat people. And Carl Sagan had a quote. He said, if you want to create an apple pie from scratch, first you have to create the universe. And the idea behind this is there's not these separate domains of the world, one about normal things like apple pie and one about fancy science things like the Big Bang or something. It's all the same world and we're just living in it. So in that sort of memory, we're both having today's speaker event, and after that, we will be having apple pie and other forms of pie in the room just behind this auditorium. So we'd love to have you there for a longer discussion after the event is over. To tell you more about today's event, I'll now hand it off to our faculty advisor, Andy Norman.
Thank you, Isaac, and thank you all for coming today. So every year we bestow Carnegie Mellon's Carl Sagan Prize on one of the most inspiring thinkers and actors on the planet. Steven Pinker, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Jonathan Haidt, Angela Duckworth, Daryl Davis. And we're absolutely thrilled that this year we're going to recognize another extraordinary contributor to the human project. For a little context, for a century and a half, Charles Darwin's concept of evolution by natural selection has been applied to astonishing effect. It has revolutionized our understanding of life and added breathtaking color, depth, and nuance to our picture of the world. Leading thinkers in our time, including multiple recipients of this very same Carl Sagan Award, have been telling us that Darwin's dangerous idea isn't through, that it still has much to teach us. This year's recipient, Dr. David Sloan Wilson, has been at the forefront of applying evolutionary thinking to understanding unselfish behavior and the conditions that allow groups and cultures to thrive. Here are a few of this man's remarkable accomplishments. He's opened countless eyes to the fact that natural selection operates simultaneously at multiple levels. He's shed considerable light on the origins and psychology of prosocial or unselfish behavior, and those interested in learning more, I'd recommend David's book, Unto Others. He's developed a rich evolutionary account of religion as a cultural adaptation. And you can learn more about that in David's book, Darwin's Cathedral. He's authored a wonderfully accessible guide to evolutionary thinking called Evolution for Everyone. I just finished listening to that on audiobook, and it's a marvelous introduction to the topic that'll get your mind buzzing with ideas. David more recently has written an uplifting novel that answers Ayn Rand's myopic defense of selfishness in Atlas Shrugged. David's title, Atlas Hugged. Great fun, I recommend it. And now his nonprofit Pro-Social World is teaching people all over the planet how we can evolve a world that works for all. Ladies and gentlemen, our 2022 Carl Sagan Award looks like this, and it reads, Carnegie Mellon University's Humanism Initiative recognizes David Sloan Wilson for inspired devotion to freedom of inquiry, tireless promotion of humane values, and outstanding contributions to our shared grasp of the human condition. With this, the initiative's 2022 Carl Sagan Award, November 2nd, 2022. Please join me in welcoming 2022 Carl Sagan Prize winner, Dr. David Sloan Wilson.
Well, here he is in all his photogenic splendor, Carl Sagan. Of course, I had to wear a t-shirt to my Carl Sagan lecture, standing in front of the universe. And the reason that Carl Sagan is special to us and stays alive in our minds is because of this statement here, which is part of the t-shirt of the Humanist League. We have a responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. So somehow this grand story of the universe leads to this sentiment of care and nurturance for each other and for the planet. That's what the worldview appears to anchor. And so in that spirit, we can think of these time spans, the age of the universe, 13.7 billion years, origin of life, 4.2, origin of our species, about 650,000, language, agriculture, the first cities, the major religious traditions and what historians call the axial age, about 2,500 years ago, the scientific revolution, about 500 years, Newton's Principia Mathematica, 335 years, Darwin's theory of evolution, and then two more recent events, complex system science and generalized Darwinism. These are within the last 50 years, and that's within my lifetime as a scientist. And I'm going to get straight to the takeaway message of this talk. This is what we're driving towards, is that complex system science and generalized Darwinism are more than just 10% of the history of the scientific revolution. They fundamentally change how we think about the world in ways that, first of all, refine our understanding of the past so we can retell this grand story from the origin of the life up to the present and all the milestones along the way, and to help us evolve a better world in the near future. In other words, that impulse that the grand story leaves us with to behave and to care for each other and for the planet, we have, thanks to complex system science and generalized Darwinism, we actually have some very specific tools for doing this. More than just the urge to do it, but actually the tools to do it. So let's begin with complex system science. Why is it so new and important? Of course, it's easy to understand the complexity of life in words, because life is very complex, but how do we study it scientifically? And with the advent of the scientific revolution, of course, we do it with a combination of mathematical equations, as in Newton's laws of motion, and with empirical experiments. These are the major tools of science. And both of them are powerful, of course, as far as they go. But what's important to observe is that they're also extremely limited. And you have to be a mathematical modeler to know how many simplifying assumptions are made in order to construct a mathematical model. And with an experiment, by definition, you're altering one or two, or at most three variables, and everything else must be held constant. And so you're taking a world in which there's many, many variables, And you're holding all of them constant in order to alter just a few. And of course, that's powerful. But also think about how it leaves, why it leaves out. And one reason why there's a replication crisis is that when you do an experiment and you get a result and then you try to do it again and you don't get the same result, it's because one of those other many variables that you were trying to hold constant was not held constant. And that difference made a difference. And so for all their power, mathematical models and experiment amount to a de facto denial of complexity. And I have a couple of illustrations of this, some of my favorite illustrations. This is called a jointed pendulum. And if you look at the first joint, it just swings back and forth, tracing an arc. And of course, that's very easy to model with equations. Adding a second joint introduces so much more complexity, which we can see by the blue tracing of its arc. Now, you could actually write equations for this also, but they're not all that useful because it turns out that if you, based on the starting condition, and in this case, they're starting at almost the same place, but not quite. And that little difference makes a big difference. And so their paths diverge and they trace very different lines. That's called the butterfly effect, or sensitive dependence on initial conditions. So just going from a single, in a purely physical system, a single jointed pendulum to a double jointed pendulum introduces this richness of behavior, which becomes progressively more difficult to model with mathematical equations. Here's another example closer to Newton's laws of motion. So here's two celestial bodies orbiting around each other. You can write equations for this, and you can predict the position of these celestial bodies indefinitely into the future. But now if we do three bodies, we get something like the jointed pendulum. That's the two-body problem compared to the three-body problem. And as with the jointed pendulum, although you can write equations for this, they're not very useful because if you alter the initial position of the three bodies, it gives you a completely different plate of spaghetti that traces their arc. And so very quickly, even in a purely physical system, you hit a complexity wall beyond which formal analytical modeling can't go. And so that's what complex system science is all about. And the reason it's new is because it required the advent of widespread computing. You just could not do it without computers. And so that's why the Santa Fe Institute, which is, of course, the most famous hub for this kind of research, was founded in 1984. That's 38 years ago, when the first book that brought this to the attention of the public, James Gleick's Chaos, one of the very best popular science books, by the way, ever, in my opinion, was published 35 years ago, well within my 50-year period that I'm talking about. And so here's the vocabulary of complex systems science. It did not exist over 50 years ago, and this being CMU, I'm guessing that these words are familiar to many of you. This is thoroughly part of your lives and way of thinking, but all within 50 years. And if you go back to the 20th century, it helps us realize how much the 20th century was an age of reductionism and individualism, that the inability to do this forced a certain worldview. And just to pick economics, so neoclassical economics was an attempt to mathematize economics. It was definitely inspired by Newton's laws of motion. People like Leon Walras wanted to create a physics of social behavior. And of course, you can understand its allure, but in order to do that, it required making very simplifying assumptions about human nature that's fondly known as Homo economicus, and the markets had to be at equilibrium, all to grind through the math, And so this is forced upon you by the limitations of our ability to analyze things prior to computers. The same during the social sciences. It was called methodological individualism, optimization theory, in which the agents or lower-level agents, such as individuals or genes, is part of this. So the theory of individual selection and selfish gene theory, which Richard Dawkins made so famous, also endorsed by Dennett and Pinker, my predecessors. I think all a part of this. And so this is what complex system science is helping us go beyond, all within the last 50 years. Well, now let's turn to generalized Darwinism and why it's so new and important. Darwin's theory, in addition to being one of the most powerful ideas ever, it's also one of the simplest ideas. It's based on 3 words: variation, selection, and replication. So variation, organisms vary in just about everything that you could measure in them. Selection, these differences often make a difference in terms of survival and reproduction. And replication, the traits of organisms are often replicated in their offspring. And once you put those 3 things together, something magical happens. Organisms, the properties of organisms don't remain static. They change over time as organisms become adapted to their environments. And so physics gives us the periodic table, and evolution gives us the diversity of life. And it's so powerful that wherever Darwin looked, identity by descent, the presence of design in nature, the fossil record, the geographical distribution of species, the nature of development, could be understood from this framework. And that's why Darwin, at the end of Origin of Species, concluded by saying there is grandeur in this view of life. And then by 1973, the geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky wrote, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And that's when I entered the field, by the way. I was a graduate student in 1973, and even though I was unaware of Dobzhansky's article, I was living the dream, you might say. What I was discovering is that I went into graduate school expecting to be an aquatic ecologist, and in particular, I was going to study zooplankton, and that's what I expected to do my whole life. But what I quickly learned in graduate school was that I could pick any creature, any topic, and that I could study it using this toolkit, this conceptual toolkit, and that was not at all unusual. And so in my career, I've studied an entire bestiary of organisms and questions, and so have all my colleagues. It's so remarkable, and we're a little bit numb to it, that if you're an evolutionary biologist, you could, I'll give you one example. It's Richard Lenski got his PhD on insect ecology. And then he said, insects, I don't know, they're not very tractable. If you really want to study evolution, it's got to be microbes. And so he retooled and became a microbial biologist, and he started this series of long-term experiments on E. coli, adapting to glucose as a resource, and has done absolutely classic work on basically experimental evolution. Now, in its probably 600,000th generation, just absolutely amazing work. And I profile that in one of my books, This View of Life. And so this amazing explanatory scope that is already known and appreciated within biology, and yet what became known as the modern synthesis can also be called the great constriction. And although Darwin didn't know anything about genes, with the advent of genetics in the early 20th century, the study of evolution quickly became confined to the study of genetic evolution. So around the world, and for expert and novice alike, you say the word evolution and they heard the word genes. It's so pervasive, as if the only way offspring that can resemble their parents is by sharing the same genes. When I say that outright, it's patently false. We know that offspring resemble their parents in many other ways by sharing the same culture, basically. And yet, the study of cultural evolution from an evolutionary perspective did not begin until the 1970s. There's your 50-year window. So, and also what the modern synthesis did was lead to a view of evolution that lacked purpose, as if the properties of organisms vary at random. Only the immediate environment does the selection, and there's no other purpose in nature. This became dogma as part of the modern synthesis, and Dawkins represents this with his famous statement, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiful indifference." Compare that with Sagan's optimistic statement and try to square them with each other. Do you know, actually, this seemingly nihilistic statement is being taken a little bit out of context, because if you were to read Dawkins more widely, or other people like Bertrand Russell, these are humanist heroes, more widely, you would actually find that they do have a positive view, and that somehow this stark view of the universe it ends up in a narrative which leads to care and nurturance, as strange as that might seem. So there's more than one narrative out there, which is one of the messages. But for most people, evolution is a blind process. In fact, in the conversation I had with students yesterday, that kind of came up, is that if a process isn't blind, like it's like we're trying to make a decision together, is that evolution? It's not blind, but is it evolution? And so you see, these are some of the questions that we need to be asking. And so what generalized Darwinism is going back to basics by defining Darwinism as any process combining this triad of variation, selection, and replication, no matter what the mechanism. And some of the mechanisms include genetics, of course, epigenetics, changes in gene expression rather than gene frequency, forms of social learning found in many species, and forms of symbolic thought that are distinctively human. Our capacity to think in terms of interrelated symbols is distinctive and perhaps unique, something else that we have to explain. So here's one of the pioneering books, Culture in the Evolutionary Process, published 37 years ago. There's your 50-year window. This was based on population genetics models that were developed 50 years earlier for the study of population genetics. It's also important to realize that Darwinism can be an intragenerational process in addition to an intergenerational process. And the best known example is the adaptive component of the immune system, basically the variation and selection of antibodies that bind to antigen. And there's other forms of intragenerational Darwinian processes, including neural Darwinism, and also our open-ended capacity for change. What B.F. Skinner described as selection by consequences is an open-ended Darwinian process. And so between cultural evolution, between intergenerational cultural evolution and intragenerational evolution, it means that all of the changes taking place around us and within us can be understood as Darwinian processes. And so this explanatory scope that's proven itself within the biological sciences can now begin to prove itself for everything that we associate with the words human, culture, and policy. That's what's on offer. And so here's some of the vocabulary of generalized Darwinism, multi-level selection theory, which I'm soon getting to. You can just read it. And I'm betting, even here at CMU, that these words will be a little bit less familiar than the vocabulary of complex systems science, and that's just the way it is. I mean, this is actually even more recent and much less well known. I travel in a lot of circles, and what I find is that people that are smart and well-read and open-minded, in so many respects technologically savvy, very literate about complex systems theory, are just newly encountering generalized Darwinism. They're open-minded to it. They're encountering it for the first time, or almost for the first time. That's how recent it is. Okay, so a progress report here. So I wanted to make my point about complex system science, and generalized Darwinism is more than just 10%. And I wanted to just at least plant the seed that they fundamentally change how we think about the world. And now we want to proceed to how they refine our understanding of the past and help us evolve a better future in the near, a better world in the near future. And to do that, I need to introduce the concept of multi-level selection, a key concept. Here I am with the other Wilson, Edward O. Wilson, and a Darwin impersonator at a conference about 15 years ago. And back then, we wrote an article titled Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Sociobiology. And we ended that article stealing from Rabbi Hillel, who was asked to explain the meaning of the Torah standing on one foot. So the multi-level selection, standing on one foot, is selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beats selfish groups, everything else is commentary. And the best way for me to explain that is by bringing out the chicken example, which is I've been using for many decades. And just recently, the National Geographic did a podcast on the chicken example, the problem with super chickens. It is super well done. And so I invite you to listen to this podcast, National Geographic, the problem with super chickens. So imagine that you're a poultry breeder and you want to breed a more productive strain of egg-laying hen. How might you do that? One thing that you might do is hens have always lived in groups. They still do. Nowadays they live in cages, I'm sorry to report. Anyhow, you have multiple groups of hens. And let's say that you monitor the productivity of all of the hens, and you choose the most productive hen within every group to breed your next generation of hens. What can go wrong? Well, it turns out plenty can go wrong. What you've selected is the biggest bully within each group. The most productive hen is the biggest bully. And in 5 generations, you have bred a strain of psychopathic hens who murder each other and incessantly pluck each other. You have 3 hens in this photograph because the other 6 have been murdered. And so this exemplifies selfishness beats altruism within groups. Altruism and all other forms of prosociality. Whenever you extend yourself to others, or your group as a whole, you are placing yourself at a selective disadvantage compared to more self-oriented individuals. There's something inherently unstable about prosocial behavior at the smallest scale of the individuals that are actually interacting with each other. And so that's selfishness beats altruism within groups. Well, the other solution is to select the most productive groups and use all the hens within those groups in order to breed the next generation of hens. That's between group selection. Now you're selecting for hens that get along with each other. And in 5 generations, you've increased the productivity of the hens by 160%. And so there is altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Even though it's true that altruism and prosociality in all of their forms are selectively disadvantaged within groups, groups of cooperating individuals robustly outcompete groups of individuals who cannot cohere. And Darwin understood that very well. This idea stretches all the way back to Darwin, who appreciated what you could call the fundamental problem of social life and its solution in the form of between group selection. So there's our selfishness beats altruism within groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Now let's have everything else as commentary. Once we actually appreciate this very simple dynamic, I'm guessing that all of you got this. This is not like Einstein's theory of relativity that's hard to wrap your head around. This is really simple. This is very intuitive. But once you go beyond genetic evolution and generalized Darwinism, and we think about cultural evolution and basically behaviorally flexible individuals deciding which behaviors to employ if they have a choice of behaviors, then you can see that if you create a social environment that's like the first chicken experiment, then you will be selecting, not genetically, but you'll be selecting for culturally or behaviorally for various forms of bullying or disruptive self-serving behaviors. And so we see this all around us. We see it in business with so-called rank and yank hiring practices. And this is this whole mindset that competition is unambiguously good and individuals just vary. And so why not just have them rank from the best. There's the best individuals, the worst individuals. Get rid of the worst ones, keep the best ones. Why not? What can go wrong? Well, plenty goes wrong. And there's all the data you need to know that companies that employ rank and yank practices don't do well as companies. Well, you don't have to go to business to do this. Just go to universities and look at a course where they grade on a curve. Or look at the university promotion policies. What gets promoted in faculty members? Typically individual achievement, and then being a cooperator in your department or service or things like that, or even teaching counts for much less. And so this neoclassical mindset has invaded just about every sector of life, including education, including higher education, including law, big time. And so we have constructed social environments like the first chicken experiment, and we are living the results. There's a whole tech, I'm sure that many of you are aware of Tristan Harris's Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. Google is a big presence in Pittsburgh. And just what are the tech giants? What's being selected by consequences for the tech giants? And is that going to be working well for the larger social good? I just did a podcast with Tristan Harris on his Your Undivided Attention podcast. That will be out in a few weeks. And so I invite you to visit that podcast, a very smart podcast. And he really has, I think, is a good sense of how the pathology of competition applied to the wrong places. And so what we can see here is that multi-level selection is like a perverse alchemist that turns gold into lead. Self-preservation is a good thing until it results in self-dealing and other forms of disruptive self-serving behaviors. Helping kith and kin a good thing until it leads to cronyism and nepotism. My corporation first a good thing until it leads to grotesque inequality. My nation first leads to international conflict. Growing our economies, overheating the earth. Nearly everything we see as pathological is actually a form of cooperation at a lower scale. That's the dynamic of multi-level selection, which requires us to apply competition and cooperation in a smart way. Otherwise, evolution will definitely be the problem, not the solution. And so an idea that builds upon multi-level selection theory is called major evolutionary transitions. And what it notes is that in many species, if we go back to biology, they're a mosaic of traits that evolve by within and between group selection. So you see some cooperation that evolves by between group selection, some competition that evolves by within group selection. Often you see a lot of competition. And something we really need to understand when we look at nature is that nature left to itself does not strike some kind of harmonious balance. Many animal societies are horribly despotic in human terms. So nothing we would ever want to live in, many animal societies. And many ecosystems do not function well as ecosystems. If you look at a beaver ecosystem, for example, and if you want to understand it, ask what's in it for the beaver. The beaver is modifying its habitat to protect itself from predators. It's eating the tastiest trees and so on. And what's happening with biodiversity or with nutrient cycling or what we call ecosystem services are just collateral benefits of a keystone species that's altering the environment for its own benefit. And so nature, left to itself, typically is a mosaic of cooperative and competitive traits. But that balance between levels of selection is not static, but can itself evolve. And what happens now and then is that mechanisms evolve that suppress lower level selection so that higher level selection becomes the main evolutionary force. And then those groups become so cooperative that they actually become a higher level organism. They actually become a higher level organism. And everything that we call an organism, in fact, is a product of a major evolutionary transitions. Individuals don't just evolve from other individuals. Individuals sometimes evolve from groups, as very highly cooperative groups. And so this is a major concept that wasn't even imagined until the 1970s and generalized until the 1990s. So once again, we're operating within my 50-year window. This helps us understand cancer. What is cancer but natural selection within a multicellular organisms? A cancer cell proliferates at the expense of neighboring cells. That's adaptive at that scale. Evolution has no foresight. The fact that cancers are going to result in their own demise is irrelevant. In that sense, we can think of our species as a cancer upon the earth. The fact that we might be evolving ourselves to oblivion is irrelevant in terms of the selection processes that are concerned. And so the idea that we can understand cancer from a multi-level perspective, once again, wasn't even imagined until the 1970s. And this book by Athena Actopus is only a few years old, and is a great book to read on cancer from an evolutionary perspective. Microbiomes, that term wasn't even coined until 2000. And so the idea that in addition to being a collection of genes, which are more or less identical among the cells of our bodies, that we serve as a planet for a microbial ecosystem of many thousands of species and cells numbering in the same order of magnitude as the cells in our bodies, and that selection is operating at that level. So as we live and die as multicellular organisms, our microbiomes are living and dying along with it. And so we're having ecosystem level selection in addition to individual level selection, so that our microbiomes are very much part of us. And Ed Yong's great book, We Are Multitudes, is a book on that topic. And then, as if that weren't exciting enough, we can now begin to see human evolution as a major evolutionary transition. Chimpanzee societies are of the sort that I described earlier, very despotic in human terms. There's an average day in a chimpanzee community and an average day in a human hunter-gatherer community. There's just, even though we share the vast majority of our genes, there's a night and day difference in the amount of cooperation and conflict. So naked aggression is over 100 times more frequent in a chimp community than a human community. And if you ask why is that, it's because of social control. In social control, if somebody tries to be the bully, they're successfully opposed by other members of their group. And so you can't play the first chicken experiment in a small-scale human society. Between group selection has become the dominant evolutionary force. And here's 2 books on that topic. So we became an ultra-cooperative species, and part of that cooperation is the capacity for cultural evolution, the ability to maintain an inventory of symbols with shared meaning and to pass that symbolic system down past the generations is an inherently cooperative activity. It cannot take place among enemies. And so cooperation came first in our species, and then our capacity for cultural evolution became a manifestation of cooperation. The thesis of the secret of our success is that the secret of our success as a species is not our individual intelligence, it's our capacity for culture. That's our capacity for culture. He has a whole chapter devoted to European explorers who become shipwrecked or otherwise stranded in inhospitable climates, and how they couldn't even remotely survive and reproduce in those hostile environments without the help of natives, indigenous people who called those hostile climates home. And so it's a wonderful book. And then his second book, The Weirdest People in the World. Actually, if I could ask for a show of hands, how many of you are already familiar with the acronym WEIRD? I'm so happy that it's as many as it is. It stands for Western, Industrial, Educated, Industrial, Rich, and Democratic. In other words, most of us. And the thesis of that acronym is that there is so much more cultural diversity than we've known. I mean, it used to be, this is another thing that's very recent, that we thought that there's a genetic universal human nature, And then culture is a thin veneer on top of a universal genetic human nature. And the more we study it, the more we realize that cultural differences run deeper than that, and that we are malleable enough so that differences between cultures are actually reflect histories of the shaping influence, selection by consequences, that cause us to be as different as we are. And because 99% of science and scholarship takes place by weird people on weird people, that we have to rediscover human nature. And it's a humbling experience. Humility is called for. And weird people are just outliers in many, many respects. And so this book it will amaze you. And in part, the history, I can't, I mean, ask me more about it in the Q&A. And it has much to do with religious history. So from a humanistic standpoint, it's fascinating. If you go back to ancient times, what you find is that the social unit was the family, in a sense that the individual was not a moral unit. Every family had their religion with a patriarch, and then the eldest son would be the next in line, and the other sons, the daughters, and the slaves. I mean, it was a completely different mentality. And to identify the individual as a moral unit was something that actually Christianity implanted. And then during the Protestant Reformation, the idea that everyone had to be literate so that they could read the Bible, and then we had widespread literacy, that paved the way for the scientific revolution. And all of this has just wonderful historical scholarship behind it. It is just wonderful, and it goes on. So here's the whole concept of human history from an evolutionary perspective. Here's Peter Turchin, who studies this. The long view, 10,000 years. The short view, the history of the United States of America, in his book, The Ages of Discord. And what you see in this graph here, that blue line that looks like a roller coaster, that first peak is the mid-1800s. That's when Tocqueville visited America. And historians call that the era of good feelings. And then that first valley there, that's the first Gilded Age of extreme inequality. And then that second peak is the New Deal, and then the second valley is our current moment. The red line is an index of political discord. The first one is just prior to the Civil War, and the second one is right now. And so Peter Turchin actually predicted our current predicament. And so there's a lot to read. I highly recommend both of these books. Just one chapter in this, Greek Democracy. This is an interview I did with a political scientist and classic scholar in Stanford University, Josiah Ober, on Greek democracy from this perspective, a multi-level perspective. And so back then there were hundreds of islands, of course, hundreds of polarized Greek city-states, all competing with each other economically and in warfare. And so here's your experiment in multi-level selection. And the invention of Greek democracy in Athens and elsewhere was a deliberative procedure. There was an intentional procedure. How do we go about making the city of Athens the unit, the organism, and coordinating the lower level units in order to do that? I learned through Josh. Entire social entities, tribes were invented that had no existence other than in the minds of the no prior existence, in order to stitch together the smaller communities in something that would make up the larger community. So I think that again, I very highly recommend these. Every episode in history, including the axial age, the emergence of the major religions, are being interpreted from this perspective. And so if we go back to our time spans here, what I hope is that I'm delivering, or at least planting the seed on my claim that the last 50 years, our understanding of complex system science and generalized Darwinism is enabling us to retell the past, the grand narrative of Carl Sagan, in ever so much more detail, in terms of multi-level selection. So refining our understanding of the past is something which is taking place. And now finally, the last installment of my talk, how can we use this to help evolve a better world in the near future? How can we turn this into a toolkit? And so here's some of the words that I listed earlier. And the claim is that we could actually use these to organize our own lives. And enter Elinor Ostrom. Again, I'm going to play my game. And no shaming is going on here. I just want to know, please, how many of you know the name Elinor Ostrom, please? Okay, thank you very much. I'm not surprised. She's a political scientist. She won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009, but at that time, most economics had never heard of her. She was a real maverick in that respect. And what she studied was something that you are familiar with, which is the famous tragedy of the commons, which was made famous by the ecologist Garrett Hardin in a 1968 Science article. And this is, the tragedy is that when there's a common pool resource, a resource that multiple individuals can draw upon, such as a pasture or a forest or a lake or the groundwater, then there is a temptation for individuals to take more than their share. Everyone gets a private benefit from taking more than their share, and then that leads to the overexploitation of the commons. And received wisdom was that this tragedy would always occur unless you privatize the commons, and so the whole justification for privatization is based on this, or there must be top-down regulation. And what Elinor Ostrom showed by actually studying common pool resource groups is that actually some, not all, some were able to self-manage their commons. They were able to manage their common pool resources on their own, but only if they implemented certain core design principles. And she identified 8 core design principles, and that's what won her the Nobel Prize. So I'm going to list these 8 core design principles in generalized form. I worked with Ostrom for 3 years prior to her death to generalize the core design principles. So I'm going to list them. And when I do, I would like you to bring a group to mind, some group that you know well, might work well or poorly, any group that you know, and just as I go through the core design principles, ask yourself the question, are these relevant to your group? And how well does the group that you know well actually implement these core design principles? Are we ready? Okay, so the groups that worked well had a strong sense of identity and purpose. They knew that they were a group. They knew what the group was about. That thing was important. They knew who was a member, so on and so forth. So unless there's actually a strong group in mind, then of course it's not going to function well. Equitable distribution of benefits and resources. Not sustainable for some members to get the benefits and for other members to do the work. That's the first chicken experiment right then and there. So there has to be some sense in which what a member gets from the group is proportional to what they give. Inclusive decision-making. Decision-making should be fair and inclusive, not sustainable for some members of the group to call the shots and for other members to have no input. In the first place, that's a recipe for unfairness. In the second place, it doesn't make use of the wisdom of everyone in the group. Transparency of behavior. We have to know what we're doing in order to know whether or not we are doing it. So there has to be some sense of what you agreed upon to do. We know whether you're doing it. And then if you're not, there has to be some response, but that response does not have to start out harsh or mean. It should start out gentle and then only escalate as necessary. And the story that Lynn loved to tell about that was the lobster gangs of Maine. And so in Maine, is involuted, it has all these bays, and most of the bays are owned by a group of lobstermen. Only they're allowed to fish the bays. And they identify their traps by the colorful buoys, and so those colorful buoys that are emblematic of the state of Maine actually have a function. You know whose buoys there are by the colors, and that means that if somebody comes in, an outsider comes in and lays lobster pots, they know it. So there's your monitoring. Okay, and so what do? What's the first thing that they do? And Lynn loved to tell this story. She said, what do you think? No, that would be too harsh. That would be too harsh. They tie a bow around the buoy. And she laughed when she told us these big burly lobstermen just tied a bow around the buoy, saying, "We see you." And only then would they cut the chain. So it does escalate. And while we're punishing bad behavior in this escalated fashion, we want to reward good behavior. And so abundant praise for good behavior coupled with mild punishment for bad behavior, which escalates only as necessary, is the little piece that works there. Fast and fair conflict resolution. Conflicts will occur. They need to be resolved in a manner that's fair by all parties. In a dispute, most people think that they have a point of view. Autonomy to self-govern. Unless a group can actually manage its own affairs, have the elbow room, if they're being dictated from without, of course, all bets are off. And then number 8, appropriate relations with other groups that reflect the same core design principles. In other words, these core design principles are scale independent. They're needed to govern relations among groups in addition to relations within groups. And so this is a tremendous conceptual simplification. We could use this to understand the interactions among nations in the global village just as well as individuals in a real village. And so these principles are scale independent. And so I think you can see that we can generalize this from an evolutionary perspective, that in a group that implements these strongly, it's very hard to play the first chicken experiment. If you try to misbehave, it will not go well with you. But if the implementation is lax, then of course it is possible disruptive self-serving. So basically, a group that implements these core design principles has achieved a major evolutionary transition for that group. And so generalizing these principles leads to a bold prediction, which is that what Ostrom showed for one type of group, common pool resource groups, should hold for all types of groups. It doesn't matter what kind of group, schools, businesses, neighborhoods, churches, you name it. If you have to cooperate, you need the core design principles. And so you will find your bell-shaped curve, the prediction is, and that variation will map onto the performance outcome of the group. And so we've done some research around this. Here's one article, one survey study. And in this survey study, we asked the participants what I asked of you to bring, in our case, 2 groups in mind. One, a business group, a workplace group that you know well, and then any other group of your choice. So this is a comparison between business groups and any other group of your choice. And so you provide information on how well the group implements the core design principles and how well it functions as a group according to 5 performance outcomes. And the results are a strong correlation between implementation of the CDPs and group performance outcomes. True for workplace groups along with all other types of groups. And workplace groups have an average deficit for all 8 CDPs. All 8 CDPs, there's an average deficit for workplace groups. With the biggest deficits, CDP 7, local autonomy. In other words, many people in their jobs can't do their work as they see fit. CDP 1, many people in their work don't find much meaning in their work. And CDP 3, many people are not part of the decisions that affect them. So isn't it amazing that even though businesses need the core design principles as much as any other group, that they're deficient in all 8? Why might that be? And I want to stress, these are averages. And so that means that business groups vary and non-business groups vary. Among business groups, you find some that are spectacular. Wonderful, wonderful success stories of businesses that actually do implement the core design principles and thrive as a result. And various movements like B Corps and the conscious capitalism movement are examples of these that we really want to pay attention to. But what it causes us to think about is this idea that in our species, there's two inheritance systems in our species. The genetic inheritance system that all species have, and this cultural inheritance system that is distinctive to our species. And to think of our meaning systems, our symbolic systems, as the cultural equivalent of our genes is really powerful. So let me just spell it out, that every one of you is a collection of genes. We call that your genotype. And those genes influence just about everything we can measure about you. We call that your phenotype. Every one of you is a collection of symbols. It might be religious or not, but every human, every normal human has a collection of symbols. Let's call that your symbotype to stress the comparison. And that symbotype influences just about everything that we could measure about you, the very same phenotype. And it's against that background that we can actually think of different worldviews applied to businesses as like different symbotypes. That if your worldview is Milton Friedman's shareholder value model, the only responsibility of a business is to make profits for its shareholders, that will organize your perception in certain ways that make sense to you, such as the rank and yank hiring system. And if your symbotype is Elinor Ostrom's core design principles, that will organize your perception and cause other things to be make sense to you. So Einstein was right. It really is the theory that decides what can be observed. And that's why it's so important that the way we're thinking based on generalized Darwinism and complex systems theory really can change the way we think the world and about the world, and therefore how we act upon the world. And so some of the insights which become elementary, which just flow naturally from the generalized Darwinism, is, as we can see from this perverse alchemist dynamic, that everything that's problematic as a form of cooperation at a lower scale forces us to have the global good as our ultimate target of selection. We must evaluate our actions with the global good in mind. So this leads to a whole earth ethic at a very fundamental level. The conventional understanding of the invisible hand, that the pursuit of lower level interest robustly benefits the common good, profoundly untrue, deeply and besmirchingly untrue. The fact that we have the global good in mind does not mean that lower level entities are unimportant. Quite the contrary. We need middle level entities, but they have to be coordinated for the benefit of the common group. And small groups in particular are a fundamental unit of human social life. One thing that individualism got wrong is to think of the individual as the fundamental person, and to think that all things social have to be understood in terms of individual thought and action. Individuals never lived alone in our ancestral past. Never, ever. They always lived in the context of small and, for the most part, highly cooperative groups. And so to rebuild the cellular fabric of society, to reverse what Robert Putnam called bowling alone, is one part of the agenda. The core design principles are inherently equitable and participatory. And so isn't that great that basically democracy is something which has to be exercised at all levels of this multi-level and multi-context. And so we must operate in two capacities: as designers of whole systems, and in that capacity we must have the welfare of the whole system in mind, and as participants in the systems that we designed. In that capacity there can be an invisible hand. In that capacity we can just be operating according to our local interests. And thanks to operating in the first capacity, then we are led as if by an invisible hand. So there is a legitimate version of the invisible hand metaphor. So here we are. I've attempted to show that these two recent events are much more than just 10% of the history of the scientific revolution. We look back upon the momentous events of the past, that we're living that now, and to see ourselves as like living in an important moment of intellectual history, I think is important to doing. Hopefully just given a glimpse of how this changes how we think in ways that refine our understanding of the past. We can ask the big questions about the origin of life and the milestones of human evolution, and a toolkit for making the world a better place. So as you can see, this is an invitation for more. And Pro-Social World is my organization. We like that to be a hub. There's 2 books. There's multiple points of entry. I think also the Humanist League would be a point of entry. And I wanted to end actually with a local group, PLEA, which is a community-based behavioral health organization in the Pittsburgh area. Gretchen Kelly and Stu Libman are here in the audience, and they are a group which are really at the forefront of implementing these ideas in a real-world setting. And so isn't it nice that there's actually a group in the Pittsburgh area that can be present and we can start interacting. And so with that, I will leave you with Carl Sagan. And I hope that you can see that my talk, I think, is very much in the spirit of Carl Sagan, so fulfilling the spirit of humanism in the internet age. And so thank you very much.
In addition to this wonderful thought, David has agreed to field questions for a little bit, and of course we also have who's the body as well. So do stick around. Isaac has a microphone that he can hand you if you have questions you'd like to ask. I'll pose one just to get the ball rolling, but please have yours ready to follow up.
The mic.
Thanks. So David, I'm wondering if you see any parallel between the evolution of murderous super chickens and the evolution of antisocial super influencers on the internet. I'm thinking of Alex Jones, for example, who became a sensation by creating inflammatory videos and social media posts, which spread faster and that perform better under certain selection criteria, often chosen by the social media companies. Are the selection criteria, the algorithms being used to decide which social media posts get more attention, are those skewing our culture in the way that the scientists in the murderous chicken experiment skewed chicken culture in the factories?
The short answer is yes, and to expand upon the short answer, I think it illustrates the dynamic of selection at lower levels becoming part of the problem at higher levels. And I want to say that not all of it is ideologically driven, but if you have a social media platform which is basically commercial, and so what you're trying to do is make money from it, that requires maximizing clicks and advertising and so on, and it turns out that inflammatory material does that better than reasoned material, then that's basically, you have a selection process taking place there, and the better it succeeds, the worse it becomes for the larger system. I have a colleague named Tony Biglin that recounts this for just about every pathology that you can think of. Tobacco, big pharma, the arms industry, the food industry. In all of these cases, you're just trying to basically, in good capitalist fashion, you're trying to grow your business, and at the global level, it's the perverse alchemist, as I've taken to wanting to call it. So this is, I think, very much the lens through which we need to see it. And on the bright side, and one of the smart thinkers on this is Tim O'Reilly from O'Reilly Media. You might know, some of you might know him. And he has a book called WTF ? Which is what's the future and why it's up to us. And he talks a lot about the tech giants. And in the first place, you got to admire them for what they do well. I mean, incredible things that they do Well, including their AI algorithms and so on. And AI algorithms, of course, is just evolution in hyperdrive. And so if you want to bring AI into it, then you've got variation, selection, replication processes that's just in orders of magnitude faster. But what are they being selected to do? And if they're being selected to get your package within 24 hours, which, by the way, is a good thing, but at the same time, you then have a warehouse that's toxic for its workers and other negative externalities, then the perverse alchemist has come in. And we're a step away. If we could only enlighten the Leviathans, then they could use that power for good. They'd get it. And this is another great example of how you can take a global problem and shrink it down and understand it at a village size. So basically, within a village, the only way for you to become a leader is by cultivating a good reputation. You can't be a bully, so you can't do that. So if you want to be a leader and have high status, you have to cultivate a good reputation. Then you're bestowed with leadership. There's a distinction between reputation and dominance. Dominance is the exercise of raw power. Exercise is acquiring a reputation, and that's what's needed at the global level. A corporation should basically be trying to earn a good reputation. They should be willing for transparency and things like that. Now, you might think that's an impossible dream, but there's examples, and one of the examples that's come to my attention, for all of these things, you might know more than I do, by the way, is Microsoft. Microsoft, under its current CEO, Satya Nadella, because he had a different mentality, he has actually implemented a very different culture than Bill Gates or Steve Ballmer, the second CEO. When Ballmer was CEO, a humorous org chart for Microsoft was published on the internet, and it showed a kind of a hierarchical org chart, but people were pointing revolvers at each other at every level. And Satya Nadella said, I hate to say this, kind of true. I think competition is being applied in the wrong places. And he was able to actually substantially turn one of the world's largest tech companies around. It can be done. And that is why, to me, that's why, how we behave depends on how we think. There's no such thing as a single common sense. There's no such thing as something being obvious except in the background of other ideas. And I think the more we can basically implement the concepts of complex system science and generalized Darwinism, then things will just make sense all by themselves before we go into the more complicated aspects of working with organizations and implying the core design principles and so on. So this gives me quite a lot of optimism in terms of what can be taking place over a short period of time.
So do you have a question? I'll be right over there.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, thank you for this talk. I've been studying a lot of these subjects sporadically, and I feel like it's added a lot of glue to the puzzle. So, and I was very pessimistic for a while, especially with the later topics of the social media, the topic you bring up and what you were addressing right now, and sort of how do we solve this issue? It seemed like a very uphill battle. But one thing that's giving me a lot of hope that I'm focusing a lot on and looking forward to is the future of what's called Web3 technologies. And the reason why is because the core design principles that you mentioned, you said choose a group, and I just thought of a lot of what's called, within this is something called decentralized autonomous organizations, which is an interesting term in itself if you just break down each word. But it encourages, within it, you have your core design principles initiated, and through algorithms, you enforce these activities to occur, and then you kind of encourage it through people's, again, going back to economic terms, with their money, they're encouraged to participate transparently and within the system that was designed. And so I have a lot of hope for that, and I just wanted to, it's not so much of a question, but I just wanted to make that connection in terms of like something positively going forward, which makes me optimistic of some of the issues you brought up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so exciting what's going on. I was at an event earlier this year in Austin called the Emerge Gathering. First time in the United States. Typically it's held in Europe, and it was just full of those folks with alternative currencies and decentralized organizations and bioregional development and so really exciting and very explicable in terms of the core design principles. One of the questions is whether you could actually build that in to the technology so that the interactions remain anonymous, or whether you want to build something that actually is facilitating more sort of person-to-person interactions, and so the trust is you're not entirely doing away with just person-to-person interactions. And to mention just one of these, so I share your optimism, and I think that what I said earlier about just getting people to think this way, at the Emerge Gathering, it was precisely what I described. Everyone was literate about complex system science. They even called the thing the third attractor. They were trying to work towards a third attractor. So it was all thing framed in terms of complex system science, and almost without exception, they were new to what I was presenting at the gathering. But one organization we're working with is called Hilo.com, and it's an open source, open access community platform, basically, that is we're working with, and so that's one of many, which basically provides a site for any group, absolutely free. The unit is the group, and so the connections among the groups works well. And you can imagine building up a population structure in which every portion and every group has their site for asynchronous interactions, and then that can be combined with synchronous interactions and so on. And I guess I want to make one more point, which is affirmative of this. It's really important because this distinction between inner and outer, changing the way we think, and then there's the external environment. And there's projects, including one of my own, in which if you build the core design principles into the external environment, then individuals will enter that environment, and you don't instruct them at all. And because they sense that it's a safe and secure environment, like any sensible turtle, they just come out of their shells. And this was one of the first projects we had, was a school for at-risk youth in my city of Binghamton, in which we designed the school to implement the core design principles. We did not instruct the students in the core design principles. They simply entered the school, and gratifyingly, they blossomed. They came out of their shells. And so this is called niche construction. And so we have such a capacity for altering our external world in addition to how we think. That this inner-outer is, and the need for both, is a big part of what we're doing.
Hi, my name is Rahul, and I wanted to thank you for the talk today. I think this has been very illuminating. My question is, what do you think about the impact of genetics on a person's phenotype as opposed to the environment that the person grows up in? And as an extension to this in the political realm, how do you think nations across the globe should design their immigration policies?
Well, there is, of course, a genotype-phenotype relationship. And so the way we are is to a large extent governed by our genes, but also that's altered by development with the upregulation and downregulation of genes. At the end of the day, we're all flexible, although we might be flexible in very different ways. We're all flexible, and so there's still always choice that we have in terms of how we behave and the consequences of those behaviors. And so without denying, in fact, without denying at all the importance of genetics, I think that in a practical sense, what we're working with any given person is they're working in the present, and so of course they have their genetic legacy, they have their developmental legacy, they have their experiences, and now you're working with them as an individual, and you're helping them become adaptable. And so you're helping them, first of all, to evaluate what's important to them, and then to move towards it. And there's a whole piece of this that I didn't really get a chance to discuss in terms of becoming adaptable, for which there is a lot, and Stu and Gretchen and Plea are expert at that. So I guess the point I want to make, in just a short answer to your question, is it's a kind of all the above. And how it relates to immigration policy, I think, genes would not be the first thing I would be thinking of on that topic, not at all. And I think that that's such a systemic problem. And when you look, here's the need for global systemic thinking, since immigration is being caused by all the events dislocating people in the world with climate and political unrest and so on and so forth. Any narrow immigration policy that wasn't in some kind of a global context probably wouldn't work. So that is a global problem.
Yeah. Thanks for this talk. It's been very interesting. It seems to me like the kind of the prescription that you're maybe offering here is this need to engage what might be characterized as social engineering at a wide variety of scales. And maybe I've read too much science fiction, but that immediately raises all sorts of red flags for ways that could go horribly, horribly wrong, or be intentionally abused by malicious actors. So could you maybe speak a little bit about how you see these sorts of things being done in practice? What kind of things could go wrong and how you could avoid those pitfalls?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. And one of my colleagues is Guru Madhavan, who's in the National Academy of Engineering, and he just wrote a piece. It's so fascinating. Let's have some two-word phrases. Let's have social justice, social welfare, social action, social engineering, social Darwinism. And the first three, social has a positive valence. And in the last two, social has a negative valence. Isn't that fascinating? And so I think that social engineering and social Darwinism, as they're understood by most people, what makes them sinister is that they're manipulative. They're done to as opposed to done with. And so I think anything becomes sinister when it's done to you without your consent. And anything is as benign as it's going to be if it's what we decide to do. So done with versus done to is the critical issue. And even if it's what we decide, it can still go wrong. I love all the folktales where you get to make a wish and end up regretting your wish. And so even a collective decision can go wrong. That speaks to the need to continuously monitoring of what we thought, what we wanted. So that's like monitoring at a larger scale. But what keeps this benign is that the core design principles are inherently done with, not done to. And so if you stick with the core design principles, then you're on the safe side. Now, after a group decides to do something, and it works, so it's worked for them, then you have to ask, how's it working? Is it causing harm up the scale? And so the fact that this is multi-level, and as I've said, it has to have the global welfare in mind, part of it has to be that as we're deciding what to do, first of all, it has to work for us as a group, but it can't cause harm. And so that's, again, keeps it on the safe side. So this is how I feel that it's on the safe side. And another thing I want to say is that if you actually look at the history of engineering attempts and attempts based on Darwinian thinking, they're not all pernicious. It's a much more complex social history than that. Yes, we have forms of social Darwinism like eugenics, but if you look at beloved progressive thinkers such as John Dewey or William James, they were inspired by Darwin too. In fact, historically, for what it's worth, the very first social thinkers to to embrace Darwinism were the socialists, such as Peter Kropotkin. And then the capitalists came in. And so it's always been, I think, a powerful idea that's been incorporated by different actors and sectors. But that's not the case that there's something inherently dangerous about engineering and evolution that's going to be put to bad use. Any powerful idea can be a weapon or a tool, and so we really need to keep it on the safe side. And thankfully, the core design principles help us do that. If it's done too, then you're not actually implementing the core design principles. So that's, I think, at the end of the day, very gratifying.
KD, one short question, and then we're going to make this the last one. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. Great talk. You've given me a lot to think about, and that's always a good thing. My question kind of relates to what Andy asked earlier about the social media influencers. I don't know how familiar, you might be very familiar with this, but I've read several books and articles about how CEOs and upper management score highly on scales of psychopathy. And in my personal experience, as a researcher in both academia and industry, I've encountered a lot of, as the one chart with the pistols pointing at each other, coworkers and fellow grad students who will gladly step on my rotting corpse to get ahead if that's what it takes. And then the system becomes self-selecting because the superiors, in academia, the professors who are like that, favor students who are cutthroat, and then everybody else who's basically a decent human being is pushed out. That's been my experience. So I'm just wondering, given that sometimes occurs in large organizations, how can we ever achieve this global framework if everyone is basically in it for themselves?
So that's a great last question, and of course it requires at least give me a minute to answer that question. It's a little better than what you describe in the sense that if you look at variation in businesses, or let's say nations, and one of my favorite books is Why Nations Fail by Acemoglu and Robinson, a very famous book, and they make a distinction between inclusive cultures and extractive cultures. Extractive cultures are the ones that you just described. They're despotic, basically. They're captured by elites and who are just exploiting everyone else for their benefits. So those do exist, and companies like that exist also. Jack Welch, of course, is famous as the CEO of General Electric, and a new book by David Gelles, a New York Times columnist, called The Man Who Broke Capitalism, is about Welch and his many proteges. So what you say is true, but thankfully, just as with nations, there's also inclusive companies in addition to extractive companies, and it's the inclusive nations and companies that work better. So basically, you've got your bell-shaped curve, right? And so the question is, what can we do in order to move that distribution up? And part of it is, of course, to see things clearly so that if you take, for a period of decades, the style of management of Jack Welch was celebrated as the very best way to do business. If we can actually set that right and to recognize that as pathological, that would go a long way. Now, that's kind of happened. The Business Roundtable has said that they've given up the shareholder value model, whether they actually do it or not, but it is a step in the right direction. And the more that we could actually implant the Ostromian view, then we're recognizing that would be a step in the right in the right direction. But these extractive systems can be very highly entrenched. And if you know economic history, there's just an amazing literature showing, for example, that if you look at current day levels of trust in African nations, that you could explain a lot of the variation by the slave trade centuries ago. And so the kind of trust that was destroyed centuries ago has endured to the current day. So these are like deep structures. Culture, evolution can be very difficult. This is also true in biology. Evolution is not just some stroll up an adaptive peak often. Often it's much more complicated than that, but it still can be done. So.
Wonderful. David, thank you so much. That was so intellectually invigorating for me, and I hope you all enjoyed it as well. Will you join me in thanking David Sloan Wilson?